The rain fell in a relentless, steely sheet, blurring the world outside the tinted windows of the Rolls-Royce into a wash of muted grays and bleeding neon. It was a miserable day, fitting for a miserable task. Alistair Finch despised loose ends, and the St. Jude's Orphanage was the last most irritating loose end in his multi-billion-dollar redevelopment of the city's West Quarter. From his seat, ensconced in the scent of Italian leather and quiet power, he could see the silhouette of the wrecking ball, a dark pendulum hanging motionless against the bruised sky. It was poised to swing, to erase the final obstacle, a crumbling brick edifice that had stubbornly held up progress for 6 infuriating months. Every tick of his Patek Philippe watch was the sound of $1,000 evaporating into legal fees and delay penalties. His jaw was a tight knot of impatience. "Arthur, tell me we're done with the theatrics," he said, his voice a low thrum of irritation that vibrated through the silent cabin. Arthur Pendleton, his chief counsel, sat opposite him, a man perpetually clad in a suit as gray as the day, his face a mask of professional deference. "The final injunction was lifted at 0800, Mr. Finch. The protesters have been cleared. We are greenlit. Foreman's just waiting for your final go-ahead." Alistair didn't bother to look at him. His gaze was fixed on the orphanage, a place that represented everything he had clawed his way up from. Helplessness, charity, the cloying smell of poverty. He was about to build a monument to his success on its ashes, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that would scrape the heavens. And this final act of erasure felt less like a victory and more like a tedious necessity. "Then give it," Alistair commanded. "Now." But just as Arthur reached for his phone, a flicker of movement caught Alistair's eye. A small, impossible flash of color, a bright yellow raincoat darting through the cordon of security guards. A child. A girl. She was impossibly small and impossibly fast, a frantic little bird slipping through a cage of giants. Before anyone could react, she was at the side of the Rolls-Royce, her tiny hand banging on the inches-thick bulletproof glass. Her face was pale, framed by a dripping hood, her eyes wide and desperate. The security detail was scrambling, their shouts muffled by the soundproofing and the downpour. Alistair's driver, a stoic ex-military man, turned back. "Sir, shall I have her removed?" Alistair was about to say yes to dismiss this final, pathetic distraction, but he was frozen by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the child. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was just determined. With a sigh that was pure theater of annoyance, Alistair pressed a button. The window descended with a silent, hydraulic hiss, letting in the damp city air and the roar of the rain. The little girl didn't flinch. She held up a folded, slightly damp piece of paper. It looked like a child's drawing, creased and softened by the humidity. "For you," she said, her voice small but clear over the storm. "Please, you have to read it before you break our home." Alistair stared, first at the letter, then at her face. He saw no fear, only a raw, unyielding plea. He was a man who moved markets with a word, who shattered corporations for sport. He did not deal with children in yellow raincoats. Yet against every cold, rational instinct in his body, he reached out and took the letter. His manicured fingers brushed against her small, cold ones. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met, and in that moment, the world of balance sheets and demolition schedules seemed to tilt on its axis. He pulled his hand back as if burned, the letter now in his possession. The window ascended, sealing him back in his silent, sterile world. The girl was swiftly and gently intercepted by a guard, who led her back towards the grim facade of the orphanage. Alistair looked down at the paper in his hand. It was an absurdity, a flimsy piece of pulp against the billions of dollars of concrete and steel he was about to command. He should have tossed it, ignored it, given the order. But he didn't. He just sat there, the engine humming, the wrecking ball waiting, and the silence in the car suddenly feeling heavier than all the steel in the world. The paper was cheap construction paper, the kind he remembered from a life he'd spent 40 years trying to forget. It was light blue, folded into a clumsy square. He could feel the faint, lumpy impressions of crayon through the paper. Arthur cleared his throat, a delicate sound of inquiry. "Sir?" "The foreman is still waiting for your signal." Alistair held up a hand, a gesture that required no words. He turned the letter over in his hands. It felt alien, a relic from another universe dropped into the pristine, controlled environment of his life. Everything in his world was calculated, negotiated, and acquired. Everything had a price tag. This felt different. It was a nuisance, an anomaly in the data stream of his day, and it bothered him more than the millions he was losing to the delay. He unfolded it. The drawing inside was crude, a child's scrawl. A lopsided brown brick building with mismatched crooked windows. Stick figures with round, smiling faces stood in front of it. Above them, a smiling yellow sun, despite the torrential rain outside. And in the corner, a single, gnarled tree, its branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the edge of the paper. It was the tree that held his gaze. There was something familiar about its awkward, defiant lean. Underneath the drawing, a single sentence was printed in large, wobbly letters, the kind a child makes when they are concentrating with all their might, their tongue likely sticking out the corner of their mouth. "Please don't brack our home. It's warm inside." The spelling errors were almost a cliché, something from a bad charity commercial. He should have been immune. He'd seen 1,000 sob stories, listened to 100 desperate pleas from people whose lives he was about to upend for the sake of progress. His progress. He'd learned long ago that sentiment was a cancer in the world of business. It was a weakness to be exploited in others and eradicated in oneself. He had built an empire on that single, ruthless principle. He refolded the paper, the crayon smell faintly clinging to his fingers. He felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of something acrid, like bile, rising in his throat. It was disgust. Disgust at this cheap, transparent attempt to manipulate him, to use a child to do what an army of lawyers and protesters could not. He looked at the orphanage again, at its sad, sagging roofline and grimy windows. It wasn't a home. It was a relic. A monument to failure. Keeping it standing was an act of cruelty, trapping children in a past that the rest of the city was moving on from. His tower would provide thousands of jobs, generate millions in tax revenue, and be a symbol of the city's bright, prosperous future. Tearing down this hovel wasn't an act of destruction. It was an act of creation. He had repeated this logic to himself, to the media, to the mayor. So many times that it had become an unassailable truth. He reached for the car's intercom. "Harris, tell the foreman to proceed." But his finger hovered over the button. The image of the tree in the drawing swam in his vision. The specific way one branch was thicker than the others, dipping down before curling back up. It was a detail too precise for a random child's doodle. He felt a tremor, a faint seismic shock deep within the bedrock of his carefully constructed identity. A memory, fragmented and unwelcome, tried to surface, like a body rising from the depths of a frozen lake. He pushed it down, hard. It was nothing, a coincidence. He was tired, stressed from the months of fighting. His mind was playing tricks on him. "Sir?" Arthur prompted again, his voice still maddeningly calm. "Just a moment, Arthur," Alistair snapped, his own voice sharper than he intended. He opened the letter again, his eyes scanning it not for sentiment, but for information. For a trick. Who had put her up to this? The head mistress, that self-righteous old woman, Mrs. Gable? Had she coached the child? told her what to draw. He stared at the crooked tree again, and then he saw it. A tiny detail he had missed before. On the trunk of the tree, just above the roots, was a small, barely perceptible mark. It wasn't just a random squiggle. It was a shape. A circle, with a jagged line cutting through it like a lightning bolt. A symbol. And in that instant, the dam of his memory didn't just crack. It shattered. The sterile, quiet interior of the Rolls-Royce dissolved around him, and he was no longer a 48-year-old billionaire in the back of his car. He was 8 years old again, shivering in a threadbare jacket that was 2 sizes too big. The air smelled of damp wool and disinfectant. He was standing in the yard of St. Jude's, a new arrival, a ward of the state. His world shrunk to a single, small suitcase and a burning, terrifying loneliness. He was holding a shard of sharp flint he'd found by the railway tracks, and he was carving a symbol into the bark of a gnarled, crooked tree. A promise to himself, a mark of defiance. It was his symbol, a circle for the world that had discarded him, and a lightning bolt for the force that would one day let him break it. No one else had been there. No one else had ever seen it. He had run away from that place less than a month later, living on the streets before a stroke of luck, and a lifetime of ruthless ambition had changed his trajectory. He had never looked back. He had buried that boy, that place, that memory, under 40 years of concrete and steel and rage. Until now. A child's drawing had just performed an act of perfect, impossible archaeology, excavating a fossil he thought was long turned to dust. The intercom buzzed. It was the driver. "Mr. Finch, the foreman is getting anxious. He says the weather window is closing. It's now or it'll have to wait until tomorrow." Tomorrow. Another day. Another $1 million lost. The rational part of his brain, the part that had made him his fortune, screamed at him to give the order, to crush the past and build the future. But the past was no longer a vague, shadowy concept. It was a child's drawing on a piece of blue construction paper lying in his lap. It had a face, and a name, and a symbol he had carved with his own trembling hands. He looked from the letter to the orphanage, and for the first time, he didn't see a dilapidated building. He saw the window of the dormitory he had slept in. He saw the rickety fire escape he had planned to use for his escape. He saw the crooked tree, still standing there after all these years, a silent witness. "Tell them to stand down," Alistair said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. Arthur's head snapped up, his professional composure finally cracking. "Sir, I don't think I heard you correctly." "You heard me perfectly, Arthur," Alistair said, his voice gaining a strange, hard clarity. He folded the letter carefully, precisely, and slid it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, where it rested against his heart. "The demolition is on hold. Indefinitely." He leaned back against the leather, the knot in his jaw slowly, painfully, beginning to unwind. The rain continued to beat against the window, but inside the car, a different kind of storm was just beginning. For the rest of the day, Alistair Finch was a ghost, haunting his own life. He sat through 3 board meetings, his mind a million miles away. He stared at quarterly reports, but the numbers morphed into the wobbly letters of a child's plea. His empire, the vast, intricate machine of Finch Holdings, churned on around him, but its master was absent, lost in the labyrinth of a past he had meticulously bricked over. Arthur, ever the professional, had handled the fallout from the cancelled demolition with quiet efficiency. A technical issue with city permits was the official story, a plausible and boring lie that would hold off the media for a day or two. But Arthur's concerned glances throughout the day were like a persistent, low-level alarm. He knew something was wrong. Alistair was not a man given to whims or second thoughts. His path was always linear, always forward, always paved with the debris of whatever stood in his way. This sudden halt was more than an anomaly. It was a fundamental contradiction of the man's very nature. That evening, Alistair stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment. The city spread out below him, a glittering tapestry of lights, a testament to his dominion. From this height, 70 stories up, the world was an abstraction. People were just patterns of traffic. Buildings were just blocks on a grid. St. Jude's was an insignificant smudge of darkness in the far-off West Quarter. He had built this fortress in the sky to escape the mud, to rise so high that he would never have to look down at the dirt he came from. He took the letter from his pocket. In the sterile, minimalist expanse of his home, it looked even more out of place. He'd had his tailor press the suit it had been in, but the paper still held its creases, a stubborn refusal to be smoothed out. He ran his thumb over the lightning bolt symbol. He remembered the feel of the flint, the way the bark of the tree had given way, soft and yielding, a secret shared between him and the wood. He had been Alistair Novak then, a name he had shed like a snake's skin the moment he'd turned 18. Finch was his mother's maiden name, a name with no connection to the father who had abandoned them or the system that had swallowed him whole. Alistair Novak had been a frightened, angry boy. Alistair Finch was a force of nature. He had to be. He walked over to his desk, a vast slab of black marble, and switched on his computer. He bypassed his usual network, using a secure, encrypted line to access public records. He was a man who employed teams of the world's best researchers, who could have any piece of information delivered to him on a silver platter. But this was different. This was personal. He typed St. Jude's Orphanage into the search bar. The results were predictable. News articles about his own controversial development project. Historical archives detailing its founding in the late 19th century. A few glowing pieces on its current headmistress, a woman named Eleanor Gable, who had run the place for the last 30 years. He kept digging. He searched for admission records from 40 years ago. Most were sealed, confidential. But he was Alistair Finch. Firewalls were just suggestions. With a few keystrokes, he was in the city's digital archives, a place he shouldn't have been. He found the file. Novak, Alistair, admitted, October 12th. Discharged November 5th. Status: runaway. Less than a month. It had felt like a lifetime. There was a grainy black and white photo attached. A scowling boy with eyes too old for his face, his hair a messy thatch. He stared at the face of the boy he had been, feeling a profound sense of dislocation. He felt no connection to that child, only a deep, abiding pity that was quickly curdled by resentment. That boy's weakness was the engine of his own strength. He had built his entire life on the promise that he would never be that helpless again. He closed the file. It told him nothing he didn't already know. He then searched for the girl. He didn't know her name. He typed in keywords: St. Jude's, protest, child. Nothing. She was just another anonymous face in the crowd, a ghost. But she wasn't. She knew about the symbol. How? The question hammered at him, a relentless, driving rhythm. Had Mrs. Gable found the carving on the tree? Was it some local orphanage legend she had passed on, a story to tell the children? And she had armed this specific little girl with that knowledge, a tiny, emotional assassin sent to pierce his armor? It was the only logical explanation, a calculated, desperate move by a woman about to lose her life's work. The thought hardened him, the familiar chill of cynicism, a welcome relief from the strange, warm tide of memory. He was being played. Of course he was. The world was a chessboard, and he had been so lost in his own power, he had nearly missed a clever move from a seemingly insignificant opponent. He would not be manipulated, especially not by a ghost from his past. The decision settled in him, cold and clear. The demolition would proceed tomorrow. He would give the order first thing in the morning. This moment of weakness was over. He would tear down the building, and the tree with it. He would pulverize every last brick, every root, until there was nothing left but dust. He would build his tower so high it would cast a shadow over the entire West Quarter, a permanent eclipse of the past. He closed his laptop. He turned his back on the city lights and walked towards his bedroom, the vast, empty space that echoed with his solitude. He felt a sense of control return, the comforting numbness that had been his constant companion for decades. But as he lay in his enormous bed, surrounded by the trappings of his immense success, he couldn't escape the feeling of the cheap, creased paper in his jacket pocket. And in the darkness, the face of the little girl in the yellow raincoat returned, her eyes not accusing but asking. And for the first time in a very long time, Alistair Finch was afraid of the answer. The next morning, Alistair awoke before dawn, a habit forged in the lean years when sleeping late felt like a form of theft. He went through his morning ritual with the precision of a surgeon: a cold shower, a black coffee, a perusal of the Asian and European market reports. It was a routine designed to armor him for the day, to reinforce the identity of Alistair Finch, the master of his universe. But today, the armor felt thin. He put on a charcoal gray suit, the fabric a whisper of wealth, and as he was selecting a tie, his fingers brushed against the letter, still in the jacket from the day before. He pulled it out and looked at it again in the cold gray light of morning. His resolve from the night before, so clear and hard in the darkness, now seemed brittle. The drawing was just a drawing. The symbol was just a mark. He was a fool for letting it affect him. He was Alistair Finch, not some sentimental old man. He slipped the letter into the pocket of his fresh suit. He didn't know why. Perhaps to remind himself of the enemy's tactics. He arrived at his office on the 50th floor of his current flagship building, a sleek black tower that dominated the financial district. Arthur was already there, a file in his hand and a carefully neutral expression on his face. "Good morning, sir. I've prepared the revised demolition schedule. We can proceed at 1,000 hours, assuming you give the final confirmation." "Huh, I'll review it," Alistair said, striding past him into his office. The office was an extension of his penthouse. Minimalist, expensive, and with a view that could make a king feel humble. But Alistair's gaze went straight to the large architectural model of the Finch Tower that stood in the corner. It was a marvel of design, a twisting spire of silver and glass that would redefine the city's skyline. His legacy. He ran his hand over its smooth, cool surface. This was real, tangible. The future. The orphanage was the past. A ghost. "The media is starting to bite, sir," Arthur said from the doorway. "The technical difficulties story won't hold for much longer. They're spinning it as you caving to public pressure." Alistair's jaw tightened. The media. A pack of jackals that nipped at his heels, forever trying to take him down. "They can spin whatever they like," he said. "It changes nothing." But it did. The idea of being seen as weak, as someone who could be swayed by public opinion or, worse, a child's drawing, was intolerable. It reinforced his decision. The building had to come down. Today. He sat at his desk, a massive expanse of polished mahogany, and pulled out a pen. He was about to sign the order, to finally put an end to this ridiculous episode. But his hand hesitated. He found himself staring out the window, his eyes seeking out the West Quarter. He couldn't see the orphanage from here, but he knew it was there. And the girl. What was her name? He had a sudden, overwhelming urge to know. It was a tactical imperative, he told himself. Know your enemy. "Arthur," he said, his voice clipped, "I want to know the name of the child who approached my car yesterday. And I want to know everything about her." Arthur blinked, surprised by the request. "Sir, I'm not sure of the relevance." "Don't question me, Arthur." Just do it. I want a full file on my desk within the hour. Discreetly. Of course, sir. Arthur retreated, leaving Alistair alone with his thoughts. This was a deviation from the plan, a complication. But he justified it as due diligence. He needed to understand the full scope of the manipulation being used against him before he acted. It was a stall, and a small, honest part of his brain knew it. While he waited, he found himself unable to focus on work. He pulled up the orphanage's meager, outdated website. There were pictures of smiling children, fundraising bake sales, a Christmas play. It was all so painfully, pathetically wholesome. He scanned the faces, looking for the girl from yesterday. And then he saw her. She was in a group photo from a summer picnic, a gap-toothed smile on her face, her arm around a smaller boy. The caption underneath read, "Lily and Sam enjoying the sunshine." Lily. Her name was Lily. It was a simple, gentle name, a name that felt like a spring flower. It didn't fit the image of a tiny assassin. He read on. The website had a section called Our Family, with short, sanitized biographies of some of the children. He found hers. Lily, age 7, came to us 2 years ago, a bright and curious girl who loves to draw and read stories. Her favorite place is under the big oak tree in the yard, which she calls the guardian tree. The guardian tree. The crooked, gnarled tree from her drawing. The tree with his symbol carved into its bark. The words hit him harder than he expected. She hadn't just drawn a tree. She had drawn her favorite place in the world. A place that he was about to turn into rubble. An hour later, Arthur returned with a thin file. He placed it on Alistair's desk with the solemnity of a priest at a funeral. Her name is Lily Carter, sir. Age 7, parents deceased. A car accident 2 years ago. No known relatives. She's been a ward of the state, in the care of St. Jude's ever since. The words were clinical, factual, but they painted a picture of a life shattered, a small girl left utterly alone in the world, clinging to the only home she had left. Just like him. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He had always seen his own story as unique, a singular epic of survival and triumph. But here it was, a smaller, newer version of the same tragedy, playing out right in front of him. And he was the villain of this story. He was the monster who was about to make a lonely little girl homeless, all over again. He opened the file. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the information Arthur had recited, and a photograph. It was a school picture. Lily, smiling shyly at the camera, a blue ribbon in her hair. She looked so small, so fragile. He saw his own childhood in her eyes, the same defensiveness, the same quiet watchfulness, the same desperate hope for something better. He closed the file. The pen lay on his desk, next to the demolition order. One stroke of that pen could shatter her world, just as his had been shattered. He had always told himself that his past had made him strong, that the fire of his childhood had forged him into steel. But what if it had just burned away his humanity? What if he had spent his whole life becoming the very thing he had always hated? The faceless, careless force that breaks things just because it can. He stood up and walked to the window. The city sprawled below, indifferent. His tower, when it was built, would be just another building. A monument to a man who had forgotten what it was like to be a child, to be scared, to have nothing but a single, safe place to call home. He thought of Lily, under her guardian tree. He thought of the boy he had been, carving a symbol of defiance into its bark. That boy had been a survivor. What was Lily? He picked up the intercom. Arthur. Yes, sir. Cancel the 1,000 hours demolition and clear my schedule for the rest of the day. Sir, may I ask what? I'm going out, Alistair said, his voice raw. There's something I have to see for myself. He left the file on his desk, but the image of Lily's face was burned into his mind. He walked out of his office, past his bewildered assistant, past the trappings of his power, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't know where he was going or what he would do when he got there. He was just a man, following a ghost. Alistair didn't take the Rolls-Royce. He took a nondescript black sedan from the company's fleet, and he drove himself. The act of driving was grounding, the physical connection to the machine a welcome distraction. He hadn't driven himself in years. He had people for that. But this was a journey he had to make alone. He drove towards the West Quarter, the gleaming skyscrapers of the financial district shrinking in his rearview mirror. The neighborhoods became older, the buildings lower, the streets narrower. The gloss of wealth and power wore away, revealing the city's grittier, more honest foundations. He parked a block away from St. Jude's, on a street lined with aging brownstones and struggling storefronts. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still a uniform, oppressive gray. He got out of the car, feeling conspicuous in his $1,000 suit. He pulled up the collar of his overcoat and walked towards the orphanage. The police cordon was gone, but a few dedicated protesters remained, huddled under a makeshift tarp, drinking coffee from paper cups. They watched him approach, their faces a mixture of curiosity and contempt. They didn't recognize him. To them he was just another suit, another component of the machine that was trying to crush their community. He ignored them and stood across the street from the orphanage. It looked even more forlorn in the flat, gray light. The bricks were crumbling, the paint on the window frames was peeling. It was a place worn down by time and neglect. And yet there was a light on in one of the downstairs windows, a warm yellow glow that was a small act of defiance against the gloom of the day. He could hear the faint sound of children's laughter. He walked around the block, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. He came to the back of the property, which was enclosed by a rusty chain-link fence. And there it was. The yard. And the tree. It was exactly as he remembered it, exactly as it was in the drawing. A sprawling, ancient oak, its branches gnarled and twisted, its lean as stubborn and defiant as he felt as a boy. It was bigger than he remembered, its canopy a vast protective umbrella. It had survived. For 40 years it had stood here, weathering storms, seasons, and the relentless march of the city around it. It had kept his secret. He gripped the chain-link fence, his knuckles white. He could see the spot, near the base of the trunk. Even from this distance, he thought he could make out the faint, scar-like outline of a circle. He needed to get closer. He looked around. The alley was deserted. He was Alistair Finch, a man who commanded armies of lawyers and executives, and he was about to climb a fence like a common trespasser. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but the pull of the past, of the unanswered question, was stronger than his dignity. He found a foothold, and with a grunt of effort that his pampered body protested, he hauled himself over the fence, landing awkwardly on the damp grass on the other side. He straightened his suit, feeling foolish and exhilarated. He was breaking his own rules, crossing his own boundaries. He walked slowly, reverently, towards the tree, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the soft earth. The air under the canopy was still and quiet. It smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a smell that was viscerally, shockingly familiar. It was the smell of his childhood. He reached the trunk. It was thick, its bark a rugged, deeply grooved landscape. He knelt, his knees protesting, and ran his hand over the rough surface, and then he found it. The symbol. It was still there, faded, weathered, stretched by 40 years of growth, but unmistakable. A circle, and a lightning bolt. His mark. He traced it with his finger, a jolt going through him as if he had touched a live wire. It was real. It had all been real. He had stood on this very spot, a lost and broken boy, and made a vow to the world, and the tree had remembered. It's a magic symbol. The voice was small, and it came from above him. He looked up, startled. Perched on one of the thick, low branches of the tree, her legs dangling, was Lily. She was wearing a worn pink sweater and jeans, and she was holding a book in her lap. She was looking down at him, not with fear, but with a kind of calm, childlike curiosity. She seemed to find it perfectly normal that a man in a suit had just climbed the fence and was now kneeling at the base of her tree. "What did you say?" Alistair asked, his voice hoarse. He slowly got to his feet, feeling immense and clumsy in her presence. "The mark," she said, pointing to the symbol. "Mrs. Gable says it's been here forever. I think a wizard made it, to keep the tree safe. That's why it's the guardian tree." A wizard. The corner of Alistair's mouth twitched. He hadn't been called that before. "Did Mrs. Gable tell you to draw it, in the letter?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lily shook her head. "No, I just like it. It's my favorite part of the tree. I drew it for you so you would see that the tree is special, so you wouldn't knock it down with the rest of our house." Her logic was so simple, so pure, it was devastating. There was no conspiracy, no manipulation, just a little girl who loved a tree and wanted to save her home. She had no idea of the bomb she had detonated in his life. She had simply shown him a piece of his own soul that he had lost, and she had done it with a crayon. "You're the man from the car," she said, her head tilted. "You're the one who wants to break our home." "Why?" The question, asked with such genuine, unadorned confusion, was harder to answer than any question he had ever faced in a boardroom. He had 100 logical, financially sound reasons. He could have talked about urban renewal, job creation, economic stimulus. But looking into the clear, honest eyes of this 7-year-old girl, all of those reasons felt like dust. They were excuses, not answers. He started, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he was tearing down her home to build a monument to his own ego? That he was erasing her world to escape his own past? He looked away from her, at the orphanage. "It's an old building," he said lamely. "Sometimes old things need to be replaced with new things." "But we like old things," Lily said. "Old things have stories. Mrs. Gable says this house has seen 100 years of children. That's a lot of stories. Your new building won't have any stories. It will just be tall." She said the word tall as if it were a synonym for empty. And in that moment, he saw his gleaming tower through her eyes. A hollow, soulless thing, devoid of history, of warmth, of life. Just a tall, empty building. He looked back at Lily. "What's the book you're reading?" he asked, changing the subject, feeling desperate to steer the conversation away from his own indefensible position. She held it up. It was a worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. "It's about how things become real," she said. "If you love something enough, it becomes real. This house is real. This tree is real." He had spent his life accumulating things: cars, houses, companies, art. But he suddenly wondered if he owned anything that was truly real, in the way Lily meant, anything that he loved enough. "I have to go," he said abruptly. The conversation was too much. The proximity to this child, to this place, was stripping away his defenses layer by layer, and he felt dangerously exposed. He turned to leave, to retreat back over the fence to his world of concrete and numbers. "Wait," Lily called out. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. "You have a sad face," she said, her voice soft. "Even in your big fancy car, you looked sad. I hope you find a real house someday, too." He didn't answer. He couldn't. He walked away, climbed the fence with a clumsy haste, and got back in his car. He drove away from St. Jude's, but he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he could never truly leave it behind again. The ghost of Alistair Novak was no longer a ghost. He was sitting in the passenger seat, and he was finally ready to talk. The drive back to the city center was a blur. Alistair's mind was a chaotic storm of images and emotions. Lily on the branch, the symbol on the tree, the boy with the flint in his hand, the sad look on his own face reflected in a car window and seen by a 7-year-old girl. When he arrived back at his office, Arthur was waiting for him, his face etched with a decade's worth of worry. "Sir, the mayor's office has called 5 times. The press is camped out in the lobby. They want a statement about the indefinite delay." Alistair walked past him as if he were a ghost. He went to the architectural model of the Finch Tower and stared at it. It was a beautiful object, a perfect representation of his ambition. But Lily was right. It was just tall. It had no stories, no heart. He thought about the Velveteen Rabbit, the idea of something becoming real through love. He had never loved anything. He had acquired, he had conquered, he had controlled. But love was a liability, a weakness. It was the thing that made you vulnerable. And yet, the memory of his finger tracing that symbol on the tree, that felt more real than anything he had built or bought in his entire life. "Arthur," he said, his back still to the room, "get Mrs. Gable on the phone for me." Arthur was stunned into silence for a moment. "Eleanor Gable? From the orphanage, sir?" "Is there another Mrs. Gable causing me this much trouble?" Alistair retorted, a hint of his old sarcasm returning, but it was hollow. "Yes, sir. Right away." A few minutes later, Arthur buzzed him. "I have her on the line, sir. Shall I patch her through?" "Yes." There was a click, and then a woman's voice, clear and steady, with the faint, weary tone of someone who has been fighting a losing battle for a very long time. "This is Eleanor Gable." "Mrs. Gable, this is Alistair Finch." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the suspicion, the confusion. "Mr. Finch," she said finally, her voice guarded, "to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "I want to arrange a meeting," he said, getting straight to the point. "With you, at the orphanage, this afternoon." Another pause. "A meeting? About what?" "If this is about another offer, I can assure you our position hasn't changed. This place is not for sale." "It's not about an offer," he said. "I just want to talk and to see the facility." He could feel her skepticism through the phone line. He couldn't blame her. A week ago he was trying to bulldoze her life's work. Now he was asking for a tour. "Why the sudden interest, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You've shown nothing but contempt for this place and the children who live here for the past 6 months." He deserved that. He deserved worse. He took a deep breath. Honesty. It was a tool he rarely used, but it was the only one he had left. "Something has come to my attention," he said, choosing his words carefully. "A piece of information that has caused me to reconsider my position. I can't explain it over the phone. Please, just an hour of your time." He hated the pleading tone in his own voice, but he was past the point of pride. He needed answers. He needed to understand. He heard her sigh, a long, tired exhalation. "Very well, Mr. Finch. 3 o'clock. But I'm warning you. If this is some kind of trick, some new legal maneuver—" "It's not," he said, and the certainty in his own voice surprised him. "I'll be there at 3. He hung up the phone. He looked at Arthur, who was staring at him as if he had grown a second head. "Cancel my afternoon," Alistair said, "all of it." "Sir, you have a meeting with the transportation secretary." "Cancel it," Alistair repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Something more important has come up." As Arthur scurried off to dismantle his carefully constructed schedule, Alistair went back to the window. He looked down at the city, at the relentless flow of traffic, the anonymous scurrying of millions of people, each with their own stories, their own homes, their own guardian trees. He had always seen himself as above it all, separate from it. But now he felt a strange, unfamiliar pang of connection. He was one of them. A man with a past he couldn't outrun and a future he could no longer clearly see. All because a little girl in a yellow raincoat had handed him a letter. At precisely 3 o'clock, Alistair stood once again before the worn wooden door of St. Jude's. This time, he knocked. The door was opened by a woman in her late 60s, with a kind, wrinkled face and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through his expensive suit. She was tall and slender, with an air of unshakable dignity. This was Eleanor Gable. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "You're punctual. Please come in." He stepped inside, and the world changed. The air, which outside had been crisp and cold, was now warm and filled with the scent of baking bread and lemon-scented floor polish. The foyer was clean but shabby. The wooden floors were worn smooth by the passage of countless feet. The walls were covered in children's artwork, a riot of joyful, chaotic color. It was nothing like the cold, sterile, perfectly designed spaces he inhabited. It was messy, and lived in, and alive. "My office is this way," Mrs. Gable said, leading him down a short hallway. He could hear the distant sounds of children playing, a high-pitched, happy chatter that felt alien and strangely comforting. Her office was small and cluttered. Bookshelves overflowed with books. Files were stacked high on every available surface. A large oak desk dominated the room, covered in paperwork. It was the office of a woman who had too much to do, and not enough time or resources to do it. She gestured to a worn leather armchair. He sat. She sat behind her desk, her hands folded, her gaze unwavering. "All right, Mr. Finch," she said. "You have your meeting. What is this all about?" He didn't know where to begin. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. He unfolded it and placed it on the desk between them. Mrs. Gable looked at the drawing, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "Ah, yes," she said. "Lily's masterpiece. She was so proud of that, and so determined to give it to you. I tried to stop her, you know. I told her it was foolish, that a man like you wouldn't care. I'm glad to see I was wrong." "The symbol," Alistair said, his voice low. He pointed to the mark on the tree trunk. "The lightning bolt. I need to know where it came from." Mrs. Gable frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "The symbol? I don't know. As far as I know, it's always been there. It's part of the tree. The children have all sorts of stories about it. Lily thinks it's a wizard's mark. One of the older boys is convinced it's a sign from aliens." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why is it so important to you?" He couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. It was too raw, too unbelievable. "I have an interest in local history," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "I believe that mark may have some historical significance." She clearly didn't believe him. Her gaze sharpened. "Mr. Finch, I have spent the last 30 years of my life in this building. I have fought developers, city councils, and budget cuts to keep it open. I have poured my heart and soul into giving these children a safe and loving home. I do not have time for games. You halt a multi-million-dollar demolition, a project you fought for like a bulldog, and you show up here asking about a doodle on a tree? You're going to have to do better than that." He was cornered. She was right. He owed her the truth, or at least a part of it. He took a deep breath. "40 years ago," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I was a resident here, for a very short time. My name was Alistair Novak." The change in her expression was immediate. The suspicion in her eyes was replaced by a look of utter, profound shock. She stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. Alistair Novak, she repeated softly, as if testing the name on her tongue. I remember that name. I was just starting here then. A young social worker. You were a very angry, very quiet little boy. You ran away after only a few weeks. We were all so worried about you. He felt the walls of his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. She remembered him. He wasn't just a file in an archive. He was a memory. A person. I carved that symbol into the tree, he said, the confession feeling like a physical weight being lifted from his chest. The day before I ran away. It was a promise I made to myself. Mrs. Gable just stared at him, her eyes wide. She looked from his face to the drawing, and back again. She seemed to be trying to reconcile the image of the ruthless billionaire who had been trying to destroy her home with the ghost of a small, angry boy from her past. My God, she whispered, all this time. It was you. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy and unbelievable. Lily found it, Mrs. Gable said finally, her voice filled with a sense of wonder. She didn't know. She just saw it. She saw a piece of you that you left behind, and she brought it back to you. Alistair couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. I would like to see the orphanage, he said, his voice strained, if that's all right. Mrs. Gable stood up, her movements slow, as if she were in a dream. Of course, Alistair, she said, and the use of his first name, a name she hadn't spoken in 40 years, felt both strange and deeply comforting. Let me show you your home. She led him on a tour, and for Alistair, it was like walking through a dream. The building was both intimately familiar and completely alien. The layout was the same, but everything was colored by 40 years of life that he had not been a part of. He saw the dining hall, the long, scarred wooden tables where he had eaten his meals in silence, refusing to speak to anyone. Now it was bright and cheerful, the walls covered in murals of cartoon animals. He saw the dormitory he had slept in, a large room lined with beds. His bed had been by the window, the one that overlooked the fire escape. He had spent hours staring out that window, plotting his escape. Now the beds were covered in colorful, mismatched quilts, and each small space was personalized with a stuffed animal, a poster, a drawing. These weren't just beds. They were homes. He saw children everywhere. A group of older boys were engrossed in a video game in the common room. A handful of younger children were sitting in a circle on the floor, listening as a young caregiver read them a story. He saw Lily sitting at a table in the corner of the library, carefully drawing in a notebook. She looked up as they passed, and her face broke into a wide, sunny smile when she saw him. She waved. He, Alistair Finch, the man who made Wall Street tremble, felt a sudden, absurd urge to wave back. He gave a small, awkward nod instead. Lily's smile didn't falter. It was as if she had expected nothing more. Finally, Mrs. Gable led him outside, to the yard, to the tree. He stood before it, no longer a trespasser, but a prodigal son. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the trunk, against the symbol. He could feel the rough bark under his hand, the steady, ancient life of the tree. He closed his eyes. We need a new roof, Mrs. Gable said, her voice pulling him back to the present. He opened his eyes. She was looking up at the sagging roof line of the orphanage. The boiler is on its last legs, and the plumbing is a nightmare. The city cut our funding by 20% last year. I've been trying to raise money, but it's just not enough. We're just treading water. That's why your offer was so tempting to the board of directors. They saw the money, and they saw a way out of a constant struggle. He looked from the crumbling building to the woman standing beside him. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the deep lines of worry etched around her eyes. But he also saw a fierce, unyielding strength. She was the guardian of this place. She was the one who made it real. This place, it's more than just a building, isn't it? He said, the question rhetorical. It's a family, she said simply. For many of these children, it's the only family they've ever known. When you threatened to tear it down, you weren't just threatening a building, Mr. Finch. You were threatening to tear a family apart, to scatter these children to the wind, to different foster homes, different cities, to take away the only stability they have. He finally understood. He hadn't just been erasing a part of his own past. He had been about to repeat it, to inflict the same trauma, the same ruthlessness, on a new generation of children. He was perpetuating the cycle he had spent his life trying to escape. The weight of that realization was crushing. He had been so blind, so consumed by his own pain, his own ambition, that he had become the very thing he despised. He turned to Mrs. Gable. What do you need?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She looked at him, confused. "I don't understand." "The roof, the boiler, the plumbing," he said, his words coming faster now, a plan forming in his mind, a new kind of blueprint. "What would it take to fix it all, to make this place not just survive, but thrive? I want a number, a real number. Don't lowball me. I want a list of everything you need, from a new roof to new computers for the library." Mrs. Gable stared at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Mr. Finch, Alistair, what are you saying?" "I'm saying the demolition is canceled. Permanently," he said. "And I'm saying that Finch Holdings is about to make a new investment. Not in a tower of steel and glass, but in something real." He looked at the crooked, gnarled tree, at the symbol he had carved so long ago as a mark of defiance. And he realized that true strength wasn't about breaking the world. It was about building it up. It wasn't about escaping the past. It was about making peace with it. "I'm coming home," he whispered, to the tree, to the boy he had been, and to the man he was finally, after all these years, ready to become. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity that shook the foundations of both Finch Holdings and St. Jude's Orphanage. Alistair moved with a speed and decisiveness that his company had long been famous for, but this time, the energy was directed not at a hostile takeover, but at a radical act of creation. He dispatched a team of the city's best architects and engineers, the very same team that had designed his tower, to St. Jude's. Their new brief was not to design a wrecking ball's path, but to assess, restore, and improve. They were to make the building safe, modern, and comfortable, without sacrificing an ounce of its history or its warmth. Arthur Pendleton, who had spent his career navigating the cold, hard lines of corporate law, was now tasked with setting up a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation, the St. Jude's Fund, with a single, permanent mandate: to ensure the orphanage, and others like it, would never again have to worry about a leaking roof or a broken boiler. Arthur, to his own surprise, found the work more satisfying than any merger he had ever brokered. The media, which had been baying for Alistair's blood, was thrown into a state of baffled confusion. The story was too good, too perfect. The ruthless tycoon had had a change of heart. The villain had become the hero. They wrote glowing articles, praising his philanthropy and his newfound social conscience. Alistair ignored them all. He wasn't interested in public redemption. His focus was singular. He spent hours at the orphanage, walking the halls, talking to Mrs. Gable, and most importantly, getting to know the children. At first they were wary of him. He was the monster from the stories, the rich man who had tried to take their home. He was stiff and awkward and didn't know how to talk to them. He tried to give them gifts, expensive toys, the latest electronics, but they were met with polite but distant thanks. They didn't want his things. They just wanted his time. He learned this from Lily. He found her one afternoon, sitting under the guardian tree as always. He sat down on the grass near her, a respectable distance away. He didn't say anything. He just sat. For a long time they sat in silence, watching the construction crews work on the roof. "You don't have to be sad anymore," Lily said without looking at him. "You're fixing our house, so you can be happy now." "It's not that simple," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Being happy. It takes practice, I think. My mom said happiness is like a butterfly," Lily said, her voice soft. "If you chase it, it flies away. But if you sit very still, it might come and land on your shoulder." He looked at her, at this small, 7-year-old philosopher, and he felt a profound sense of peace. He had been chasing happiness his entire life, thinking he could acquire it, build it, conquer it. But maybe Lily was right. Maybe he just needed to sit still. So he did. He started visiting every day. He wouldn't announce his arrival. He would just appear, and he would sit. Sometimes he would sit with Lily under the tree. Sometimes he would sit in the library, listening to the older kids talk about school. Sometimes he would sit in the kitchen, watching the cook prepare dinner, the familiar smells of his childhood wrapping around him like a warm blanket. He started to learn their names. Sam, the little boy who was Lily's best friend, who was terrified of thunderstorms. Maria, a teenager who dreamed of being a doctor. David, a quiet boy who could lose himself for hours in a book. They were not just orphans. They were people. They had stories. They had dreams. And slowly, cautiously, they began to let him into their world. One day, David came and sat next to him in the library. He didn't say anything. He just opened his book and started to read. Alistair looked at the cover. It was a history of the city's industrial age, a topic Alistair knew intimately. "That's a good book," Alistair said quietly. "The chapter on the shipping magnates is particularly interesting." David looked up, surprised that this quiet man in the suit knew anything about his book. "You've read it?" "A long time ago," Alistair said, and for the next hour they talked. About books, about history, about the city. It was the first real conversation he had had with anyone in years that wasn't about money or power. It was just a conversation. The butterfly had landed on his shoulder. The renovations were completed in record time. The orphanage was transformed. It was the same building, with the same heart, but it was now strong and safe and bright. The new roof didn't leak. The new boiler hummed quietly and efficiently. The library was filled with new books and computers. The yard was re-landscaped, with a new playground and a small garden. The guardian tree stood untouched, the center of it all. There was a small, quiet ceremony to celebrate the reopening. The mayor came and made a speech. The media was there, but they were kept at a distance. Alistair didn't make a speech. He stood at the back of the crowd, next to Mrs. Gable. As the mayor cut a red ribbon, she turned to him, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Alistair," she said. "You didn't just save a building, you saved a family. You saved us." He just shook his head, a lump in his throat. "No," he said. "You saved me." Later that day, after everyone had gone, he found Lily under the tree. She had a piece of paper and some crayons. She was drawing. He sat down beside her. She showed him the picture. It was a drawing of the orphanage, bright and new. There were stick figures playing in the yard, and in front of the building, there was a tall man in a suit, holding the hand of a little girl in a pink sweater. They were both smiling. "That's you," she said, pointing to the man in the suit. "You're not sad anymore." He looked at the drawing, at the simple, heartfelt depiction of a happiness he was only just beginning to understand. He felt a tear trace a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He looked at the tree, at the symbol that had started it all. The circle for the world, and the lightning bolt for the force that could change it. He had always thought that force was him, his anger, his ambition. But he had been wrong. The force that had changed his world wasn't a lightning bolt of power. It was a quiet, gentle landing of a butterfly. It was the love of a little girl for her home. It was the simple, profound truth that some things, the most important things, only become real when you give them away. He reached out and put his arm around Lily's small shoulders, and together they sat in the quiet shade of the guardian tree, two survivors, two parts of a story, finally, completely, home.